This is the 6th episode of our For the Love of Language podcast, and we're going to talk about programming languages and whether or not they are actually languages. And so I think the main question at the center of that is what actually constitutes a language? What makes a language a language? Because until you have language defined, it's hard to say whether programming languages actually fall into that category or not.
Yeah, and the tricky thing is there is no consensus in the linguistic community about what a language is. It's a terribly vacuous, anomalous, big word, blobular, gross thing that none of us really like to talk about because I guess this is a great point to talk about the different levels of language, right? Where language can be defined in certain contexts in different ways. So for example, we have the distinctions between Spanish and English, right? And so there are certain patterns in Spanish that make it Spanish, certain common elements that no matter who's speaking Spanish, they can still kind of understand one another. Same with English. We have British English and Australian English, and, they're all a little bit different, but there are some things that still kind of make them similar enough to all be called English. But then when you break it down, again, you have those little subversions of language, those dialects, right? You have Colombian Spanish, Peruvian Spanish, Spain Spanish, and they all sound a little bit different, and they can be considered their own languages. Same with English, Australian English and Scottish English and American English. They all kind of break down into these little subgenres. And further, you can break these down all the way down to us having our own independent languages. EJ and I, we both grew up, EJ grew up a little bit of everywhere, but we eventually met in the middle in Utah, of all places. So we sound similar enough, but our individual dialects are different, that there are still some small barriers we might have to overcome to understand one another.
That's a super interesting thought, actually.
Yeah.
If we want to do like a quick digression,
yeah,
what would you say defines your idiolect?
Defines my idiolect? Oh, my idiolect is a little all over the place because it doesn't sound like my parents, because I happen to have a substantial educational background, and people might not realize this, but the more education you have, you sound different if you have more education. There's a certain level of like prestige that comes with like having degrees and stuff and being in an academic environment that twists your language ever so much. So I still have some like Utah things. And Utah doesn't have like a whole lot of weird things. It's actually a pretty neutral dialect. People in Utah might not realize this, but it's actually a pretty neutral dialect, except for like a couple of small little remnants from some like stuff that came over from England with Mormon pioneers and stuff. So it's actually pretty neutral, except for a couple of like vowels that are a little strange. We don't have a nice low ah. We kind of have a higher ah. That's one thing. But I, in particular, have picked up a couple of bad habits from Long Island. That has definitely shifted some of my back vowels personally. So within myself, I sound a little bit different from my peers and from EJ because I have an educational background. I lived in New York for a while. Like little things can change your personal language on top of like other things, like where you're from. I'm from the United States, so my English is a little bit different. But yeah, that's about me. Tell us about your idiolect, EJ.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, like, both of my parents are from the West Coast, which is also not super different from like the Utah dialect necessarily. So, I mean, my parents will occasionally say things differently than I would, like maybe crick instead of creek or some things like that. But for me, growing up, moving to a different country every couple of years with my dad's job, I was frequently in international schools. And so one of the things about that, and because I was constantly speaking with people who weren't native English speakers, there weren't many idioms that were used growing up. And so I grew up without really using very many idioms and
Oh,
without
interesting.
using much sarcasm either, because Americans use sarcasm very differently,
They do.
and maybe excessively. Don't want to like judge anyone, but it's sometimes hard for me to catch on to sarcasm. And so yeah, when I came to college in Utah, my roommates would use these idioms all the time, things like kick the bucket, cut the cheese. There's all sorts of idioms that people use without realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably like a solid year or two of me like adjusting and learning idioms
Oh
before
my
I
God.
stopped having awkward moments in my conversations.
Oh, that's something I don't think I would have considered with you kind of bouncing around all over the place. Like it makes sense that, you don't might not necessarily sound like you're from one spot, but the fact that like sarcasm and idioms maybe never quite got in there. Like when you think about it, it makes sense, but that's something I hadn't considered. That's really interesting, EJ.
Right? Yeah, it is. It is super interesting. And I think it's an interesting thing to reflect on too, like what does make your language unique? And for the most part, I think if, people here are talking to me, they're not going to think that I'm anything other than a Utahn. There's actually another really interesting thing. I don't know if you've ever done this, but for me, all the time, if I'm speaking with someone and they have a British accent, they have an Indian accent, I start imitating and like copying that subconsciously. And I
Yeah.
actually have to stop myself because I don't want people to feel offended, like I'm trying to make fun of them,
Yeah.
when I just like naturally catch on and want to start speaking like the people that I'm speaking with.
Yeah, I mean, I think people would be surprised how often this happens. And especially with people who are like empathetic, and who are really good at like listening to people, picking up on body language cues, things like that. Slipping into someone else's like dialect is a lot more common than you think, and there's a reason behind that. If we can digress even further, we'll come back to the programming languages. This is like, but these kinds of things are important to talk about when you're talking about the difference between computer language and human language, because this just goes to show that human language is just is terribly complicated. And so we're still trying to understand what human language is, let alone computational languages. So we'll circle back. Don't you worry. But this is because when humans are communicating, we want the people to trust us. We want people to believe whatever it is we're saying. We want to be like effective communicators when we're using our language to communicate with somebody. And the way that you do that, and anyone who is, maybe like done business or something or does sales will tell you that you mimic the other person, you mimic their body language. If the person leans forward, you lean forward. If the person crosses their arms, you cross your arms, right? Mimicking those little things in body language lets the person know that you're listening and that you're taking in what they have to say. And likewise, your voice might change, your voice might adjust, you might start phrasing things the way that they would, you will shift the way that you speak to try and sound similar to your conversation partner, to let them know that you're listening and you're like them and you're a valid, credible source of information and you're a good communicator. So it's a good thing, but it can be a little bit bad. Like if somebody else is listening in and it sounds like you're making fun of the person, it's like, no, your subconscious is just trying to communicate effectively. And in doing so, it's saying, hey, we got to mimic this other person in order
Yeah.
to get them to see us as like a good, safe person. So it's really quite fascinating, some of the psychology that goes into communication as well. Like
Yeah.
it's not just all about you. That's why your idiolect will change over time as well, is because when you try to assimilate to different groups of people, you will shift your language a little bit to find your place or to make a place for yourself.
Yeah, and I actually just looked it up, and there's actually a theory that covers this. It's called communication accommodation theory,
Yeah.
and it's called linguistic convergence when you try and take on the patterns of the people that you're speaking with. And then there's actually the opposite can be true as well. Like if you're trying to separate in some way, like other yourself, prove your distinctness, then you might use linguistic divergence. And you might see that in people who like try to retain their maybe Americanness if you're living in Europe or something like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. When I was teaching English as an additional language, I was working with adult speakers. And so a lot of them were very much just like, yeah, I'm always going to have my accent from X country. And some people really wanted to get rid of it, especially if they wanted like jobs in the United States, where like I had one girl who wanted to be like a TV broadcaster. And so definitely wanted to sound like she was American and not like she was from, I think she was from Colombia. But there were others who were like, absolutely not. They were like, teacher, I don't want to get rid of my accent. Like I know other people do, but I want people to know that I'm from Argentina, and keeping my accent is a way to do that. And you see that with celebrities too, like Sofia Vergara. She makes like people make fun of her for her accent. But she's kept it, not because she's incapable of getting rid of it. She has access to some of the world's best like dialect coaches. No, it's a part of her identity. It's a part of who she is. And I constantly admire her for being brave enough to keep it when so many people make fun of her for it.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And like in the film industry, there's actually an entire career you can have is to be like an accent coach and to help these actors more fully accommodate and speak like people from other places. It's super interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So your personal language is, again, you have big, broad, global language, and then you funnel it down to personal language. So defining what a language is very tricky. And so when we're talking about programming languages, these are very fascinating. And I I have a lot of feelings about these things, EJ, because I also get asked about like conlangs all the time, things like Klingon and
Esperanto.
Esperanto, yes, and about if those are real languages.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this comes down to a different philosophical point of where does language come from, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
does language come from? And language comes from people, and it comes through necessity, right? We create these patterns based on our needs. And so when you have a fictional language, it looks different than a natural language.
It does until if it does happen, people start using it and adapting it, and then it can grow into a real language. But just what someone
Into a
writes
natural
in a
into
book.
I'm going to make the distinction here, into a natural language.
Right.
Yeah. So to clarify even further, a natural language is a language that you teach to your child, and then your child internalizes that language and uses it. And I would go even a step further, because you can teach your kid Klingon, but it has to reach a certain point, right? You can teach your kid Klingon and they might use Klingon in the home, but what happens when you send your kid to kindergarten? They don't use Klingon in kindergarten. What is your kid going to feel? They're going to feel the pressure to use whatever the dominant language is. And so they might just abandon Klingon. They might become a heritage speaker of it. And at that point, it isn't, especially if it hasn't gone through enough generations, it's not a complete natural language, right? Your child needs to be able to use it in everyday life, aside from just in the home. And so that's one stumbling block with fictional languages, with conlangs, is there still aren't, like, people can use it to communicate with each other. And they do. It's great. It's beautiful. But there aren't spaces for people to use these languages in everyday life enough for them to be full natural languages and really take on all of those needs and adapt to those everyday needs of people to become a full language.
Definitely. And I think, that is partly just a question of scale. Like
Yeah.
when J.R.R. Tolkien was creating some of, the conlangs that kind of spawned the entire field of conlanery, constructed language creation, the words and the passages that you see in his book are really cool. Like they're created in a really intelligent way. He actually used patterns and tried to take aspects of different existing languages to create Elvish and the different languages that he used in his books. But you can't take what exists in his books and communicate about most of the things in everyday life. Like that's where most conlangs fall short. You have these really gifted linguists who create them for films and for books, but they don't have the breadth to actually be able to express everything that we would want to express in a normal conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's, again, not to say that conlangs aren't real languages. They're just not natural languages.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that same thread, we're circling all the way back to programming languages. Programming languages are also created by people for computers. And they have been used to communicate certain ideas. But the real thing with programming languages is it will never be a natural language because you can't put a programming language in the hands of a child. Right? I mean, you can try,
There are
but
people who try.
you can sure as hell try, but like your child has to have like a certain level of knowledge to actually be able to program, right? And that takes a little bit longer.
Yeah, well, and a large part of that. So, when you actually look at programming languages, there's a fundamental set of things that they're created to accomplish. Like most programming languages will have types. So, you'll say this thing is a number, this thing is a word. Python is an exception. Python is actually called Python because it's named after Monty Python to be like really easy and simple to use. So, some programming concepts are a little bit harder to find in the language per se. But yeah, most languages, they'll have types. They'll have more complex data types where, a classic maybe university example would be you need to be able to create a Pokemon. So the Pokemon needs to have a name, it needs to have power, attack power, like all these different things. And you're grouping those together in an object is what we call it. And then you need to be able to use what we call functions or methods to change values in memory. But there's like, these are very specific constructs that at the end of the day relate to a higher or a lower voltage in a computer, to being able to let a computer display something on a screen. But the computer isn't actually thinking. You're not actually communicating with someone who's understanding you and responding. The computer is taking orders from the electrical impulses that you give it. And you could make an argument that, well, our brains are just electrical impulses, so it's the same thing. But there's not nearly the same complexity in programming languages as you would have in a real language. And I think part of that is demonstrated by how long it takes to learn a second language versus like a second natural language versus how long it takes to learn a new programming language. When I started at my first software engineering job, I had used, Java, Python, C++ in college. So like just a very small set of programming languages. But my job was in, TypeScript, Angular, and Scala, which I'd never even heard of. But that didn't matter because I could still look at the code, look at the patterns, and understand the basics behind it and start coding, my first couple weeks without too much effort, which is not at all what it would take with a natural language.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And something that I think we as people forget sometimes is that computers are our own creation, right? And as much as we like to think of our brains as computers, we made computers. They are a simplified version of us, not the other way around. People, we forget how complex we are. We take for granted how intricate our cognitive systems are. And so while a programming language is a language, it is used to communicate with something far more simplistic than a person.
Yeah, well, and I would actually make an argument. Okay, this is going to be maybe a funny tangent, but
Let's go.
there's this red panda painting behind me, right? I
It's
am
adorable.
obsessed with red pandas. So I actually painted this at a work activity. But the really interesting thing about red pandas is that they're not related to pandas at all, right? If you just heard the name red panda, you'd be like, oh, yeah, you know, those black and white big bear things. A red panda is actually more closely related to a raccoon. And I think the same thing happens when we say programming language. Just the fact that we call it a language makes us think, oh, yeah, it must be similar to a natural language. But it's
Yeah.
really a misnomer. And I would
Mm-hmm.
say that programming languages are actually more related to, say, math or music. In both of those areas, you have musical rotation, that notation that's written down and lets you know what notes to play. You have mathematical notation with symbols and numbers that you could relate to, like the words that you use in programming. And I would say that those are more related to programming languages because you're communicating something really specific about how to do something, but you would never say that. I mean, in an artistic, metaphorical sense, you might, but you wouldn't say that math and musical notation are natural languages.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They are just patterns that we've been able to pick up on, and we have created arbitrary forms of notation to describe those patterns. I think that is an amazing example. Bravo,
Thank you.
EJ. I couldn't have said it better myself. I couldn't have said it better myself. So ultimately, what it comes down to is our programming languages not technically. And I know that might offend some people. But it's we often forget how complex humans are and how simple computers can be. And while you can do so much with a programming language, human language will still be more complex until, or even if we get to a place with computational development that we are human like, we are not there yet. I hate to
Right.
break it to everyone who is a huge fan of AI and thinks it'll take over the world in 5 years. We're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like, honestly, who knows if we'd ever actually be there? Like, when it comes down to AI and machine learning, it's just machines using the patterns that they're given to imitate, which again you could say is the same thing that humans do when we learn language. But then you get into the deeper, philosophical question of, can machines ever have a soul? Are they ever really communicating? And I don't think that we're going to get to the point where that actually becomes a valid question per se for quite a while.
At least not in our lifetime. EJ and I are pretty young. I would say within the next, yeah, like 50 plus years. We'll see. We'll see. A lot can happen in like 50 years. But yeah, I mean, this kind of goes off into just like, technological development. It's grown rapidly over the past 100 years. Who knows where it will develop next? But there's a reason that tech companies like to hire linguists. It's because they don't understand natural language. And if you want your AI to function like a person, you need a linguist who understands human language
Yeah.
to come in and work on your tech.
Well, and there's other things as well. So I think I mentioned in our first episode that I worked in internationalization on the first team I was on at my current company. And that's like being able to take the words in your product and put them all in a single place. So it's easy to send to translators and get translations into different languages. So like most large companies are going, like tech companies are going to have to deal with linguistics a little bit as far as attaining translations and being able to improve the virality of their products.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the language is like a central focus of computing for most companies still.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true. It's only in things like speech recognition
Mm-hmm.
or
Machine
even
translation.
stuff with like Google trying to like find translating, or which like set of words is going to get you your optimal output for your search engine stuff. Things like that are also things you might need a linguist for in the tech industry.
Yeah, there definitely is a large area of crossover where people might use both.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I think that wraps up the main question, and we've diverged into several other areas as well, and gotten a little bit more insight into why language, what language, huh?
Right? Yeah. But basically, to sum it up, programming languages aren't natural languages any more than like math or music might be, but they are obviously super useful, and all of our technology uses them. But calling them languages, there may not be a better term to use, which is why they're called programming languages, but it could be seen as a bit of a misnomer.
Yeah, which is something that happens in any field that you go into. This one just happens to intersect with humans and people, and all the complexity that exists there. But yeah, this has been fantastic. Thank you all so much for being here. Anything else you want to plug or say or share with our friends, dear EJ?
I'm just super excited. We've gotten some really good comments from some of our listeners, and we definitely really, really appreciate those. Always feel free to get in touch with us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. But yeah, we're really happy to have you all as listeners, and definitely let us know if there is anything you would like us to touch on in the future.
Yeah, we are open books, here to talk about anything and everything language adjacent, linguistics, etc. But yeah, thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure having you all here. Until next time.